There's even a seat for you with your name on it.
Is there a wedding date? Is there a wedding date yet?
When?
Uh-oh.
We'll make it public here. Welcome to the second panel of our little workshop today. And panel 2 is of supreme leaders and presidents, election outcomes, and foreign policy making. And we have 4 speakers, starting with Robin Wright, who's both at USIP and Wilson. And then Professor Bernard Heikel from Princeton, to be followed by Hanin Gardar, who's a public policy scholar, former public policy scholar here, and now is at the Washington Institute. And last but not least, Mohsen Milani, professor from University of South Florida. And we'll start with Robin. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me and including me in this. Much of of U.S.-Iran relations was covered actually in the first panel by Ali Vaez, so I'll be brief. I wanted to frame the relationship between Iran and the U.S. in context of the 2 very different 34-year periods, 2 of them exactly 34 years. The first period when Iran was one of the 2 pillars of U.S. foreign policy, the Shah was a pivotal ally during the Cold War. Remember, Iran then had an important border with the Soviet Union and had listening posts all along that border. But that all began to shift in 1979 for 2 reasons. One was the revolution, but the other also was the rising importance of Saudi Arabia. Because of the hike in oil prices, its strategic value suddenly became much greater. And with the revolution, the United States looked around for what could be the pillars of foreign policy in the region, and Saudi Arabia and Egypt filled that void. Well, that lasted also for 34 years until 2013, when President Obama and President Rouhani were prepared to engage with each other for the first time, and as the U.S. increasingly became independent on energy. And so the dynamics have shifted again. And much of what we see play out now is really over which of these 2 countries in the Gulf ends up as the closer U.S. ally, and the tensions play out over that issue. Now, there is no foreign policy issue on which President Obama and President Trump disagreed more than on Iran. You remember what President Trump said about NATO being obsolete, about Saudis throwing gays off buildings and enslaving women, and talked about Islam hating us. On all those issues he has changed, but not on Iran. His language has been increasingly angry, increasingly determined. You remember when Mike Flynn came out in his first appearance, and in some ways his only major appearance, and put Iran on notice. That is one thing that has not changed under the guidance of his new National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster. It was the #1 message on President Obama's first trip abroad, both in Saudi Arabia and in Israel. On the eve of his trip, the United States, little notice because of the political drama playing out in Washington, imposed new sanctions on Iran. Additional sanctions are likely in the near future by Congress, and I suspect the administration will too. They are not related to the JCPOA. The sanctions imposed last week were about missiles. One of the things that was released yesterday, finally, was the text of the agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia. And it had a very interesting sentence in it. The United States is officially still committed to the JCPOA, but the agreement with the kingdom says the following: Iran's interference poses a threat to the security of the region and the world, and the two powers agreed that the nuclear agreement with Iran needs to be re-examined in some of its clauses. This is the first time we've seen actual challenge to the language, the terms of the nuclear deal. We did see one tiny little opening with Secretary of State Rex Tillerson standing next to his Saudi counterpart, saying that at the right moment, he might be willing to talk with Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister. It's the first time we've seen any sign that there might be some kind of at least telephone diplomacy. I doubt it will go much further, but he said it would be at the right time. And then he proceeded to say that the Iranians had to dismantle their missile program, had to allow freedom of speech, freedom of organization, so that Iranians can live the life they deserve. So there was a little bit of an outreach, but a huge caveat. I think the bottom line on the Trump administration's policy is that the enemy of Iran is my friend, no matter who you are, no matter what your own political practices are at home. There was also one phrase that led me in one of President Trump's speeches he talked about a government that he hopes someday Iran has a government that will truly represent its people. And that's the kind of hint at regime change we haven't seen so far. And it was very worrying language. So that between the challenge on the specific clauses of the JCPOA and the language from Trump, you can see that we're headed to a very tough time. I think one of the things that's been striking about President Rouhani since his re-election is his magnanimity about the United States. He described it in one very funny exchange in this press conference as a curvy road over the past almost 4 decades now. And he said he reserved judgment. Unlike Trump, who has taken a very specific and tough stand, President Rouhani said Iranians are waiting for this government to become stable intellectually. Don't hold your breath. He said hopefully things will settle down so we can pass accurate judgments. He did take a potshot at the Saudis and charged that they were using their wealth to try to buy the Americans. But he said at the end of the day he didn't think the Riyadh summit would have any political or practical value in terms of its long-term impact. But I do think the flashpoints between Iran and the United States are not going to change. President Rouhani on Monday said that Iran is determined to proceed on its missile program. American officials should know that whenever we need to technically test a missile, we will do so and will not wait for their permission. This is something that Iran looks at as a defensive instrument of its defense because it has a very limited air force. And so the missiles have been critical in its military strategy. And I think that's not going to change, and that's going to lead to more tension and I suspect more sanctions by the Trump administration. I think on human rights, the great danger is that Rouhani uses very bold language, increasingly bold language during the campaign, even mentioning Karoubi and Mousavi. But I think at the end of the day, he will not be able to do very much on key issues because he does not have control over the judiciary, over the intelligence and military apparatus. And that those are the ones that have, whether it's picking up detainees, charging people with un-Islamic activities, that have been so difficult. He has limited leverage. And so on that issue, there will continue to be very tough U.S. criticism and tension. I think on the big regional issues, Syria, Yemen, and Iraq, that there will continue to be enormous differences as well. Now, the Iranians do say that they do not believe there's a military solution to Syria. They understand that there has to be some kind of transition of power to end the conflict. But they, like the Russians, are going to take, I think, a very determined stand to protect their interests long term. That has more to do with the channel and the protection of Hezbollah than it does of Bashar Assad. I think the Iranians are not wedded to the longevity of the Assad dynasty. But I do think that they want to find some mechanism, and as they often say, okay, you don't want the Assad regime, who's your alternative? And in 6 years, the United States has not been able, through its working with either the political opposition or the military rebels, to identify one person or a group of people who would be an effective alternative. Yemen is another one on which there are tensions, and as long as Saudi Arabia continues its military campaign, I think the Iranians are going to continue to support the Houthis. But again, the Iranians also acknowledge that there's not a military solution to that conflict as well. The one thing on which the United States and Iran do agree, and that is ISIS. ISIS came within 25 miles of the Iranian border, and there is a deep, profound concern in both Tehran and Washington. The question is there a mechanism to bring de facto cooperation? There has been a bit in Iraq. Iranian advisors and American advisors have both used the same bases in a couple of places. But I think that would have been much more possible under Obama. I don't think that you'll see any coordination under the Trump administration, in part because both the Secretary of State, a former Marine, is very bitter about the 1983 bombing in Beirut that killed 241 Marines. That resonates with him, and he still holds Iran responsible. He feels this personally and professionally as well. The one area, and the last thing I'll talk about very briefly, is the Europeans. And I think there is no issue which divides Washington and its European allies more than Iran. And this is for the first time that the West has generally spoken with one voice throughout the almost 4 decades of the Iranian Revolution. But what was really striking after the re-election of Rouhani and on the very day that Trump landed in Saudi Arabia were the tweets from Federica Mogherini, who said, the Iranians took passionately to political life of their country. I congratulate President Rouhani for the strong mandate he received. The European Union is ready to continue work for full JCPOA implementation, bilateral engagement, regional peace, and to meet the expectations of all people in Iran. That is not language you will ever hear from Donald Trump. Carl Belt, who is the co-chair of the European Council of Foreign Relations, tweeted that Iran voted to open up to the world, but Trump calls for isolating Iran from the world. The Europeans are more likely to favor engagement with Iran. And I think that's already been true since the JCPOA was agreed to in 2015. We've seen a steady parade of European delegations, foreign ministers, some heads of state, and a huge number of businesses go to Tehran to look for what are the possibilities now that at least international sanctions have been lifted. The French were even tougher than the United States in the final days of the negotiations on the nuclear deal, but they were among the first, surprise, surprise, to improve relations with Iran after the deal was signed. It sold cars and planes, and it's bought a lot of oil. In Britain, former Prime Minister Cameron said that Iran had reached that necessary potential to rebuild relations. They relaxed travel bans, and they reopened the embassy. The foreign minister has visited Tehran. And the Germans, these are the 3 major powers who kind of shape European policy generally. The vice chancellor and economic minister actually spent 3 days in Iran with a business delegation, and the foreign minister has visited too. So I think we're seeing, it's going to be very hard for the United States to remain its isolationist position on Iran while its closest allies are engaging. I think there's a real gap, and I think this is going to make it difficult. And the big question, of course, is to what degree is the United States going to limit its impact in Iran is going to complicate the potential for peace negotiations in Syria, in Yemen, elsewhere. The idea of the JCPOA was to bring Iran into the fold of the international community so that it could be a partner in ending conflicts. And the danger is that we are embarking on a period where conflict could be just as deeper, and play out on other issues that complicate relations.
Thank you, Robin. Bernard?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this invitation. I'm going to talk principally about Saudi Arabia and its view of Iran, both before and since the election. And I should just, of course, I also wish to thank the Wilson Center for this invitation. You know, unlike the earlier panel on Iran, where there's a considerable amount of speculation about the nature of the regime, about, because it's a dual regime between being a republic and a theocracy. When it comes to Saudi Arabia, there's actually absolutely no ambiguity, and it's a pleasure as a scholar to study Saudi Arabia because kind of what you see it and you get what you see. There's no ambiguity, for instance, on the strong desire of the Saudi leadership to be American allies, they relish in America's domination and control of the region. They don't wish to undermine the international system. They don't use non-state actors. They don't take Americans as prisoners for blackmail. And as far as the US is concerned, and as far as Iran is concerned, there are no factions within the Saudi elite about how to proceed and how to see the situation. To put it very bluntly, the Saudis do not believe anything that comes out of Iran, and this was said very clearly in recent statements during President Trump's visit to the kingdom, which was a huge success from the point of view of the Saudi royal family and the Saudi government. They don't believe what Iran says. I think this is something that is shared by the leadership in the United States, and especially the military. The military elements of the U.S. leadership, people like McMaster and Mattis, who have long experience with Iran and specifically with the non-state actors that Iran has used in the region. Here I'm thinking about not just Lebanon, but also Iraq and Syria, as well as now increasingly Yemen. So there is an identity of interest and vision between top American leaders and the Saudi leadership. That said, just like with the Americans, the Saudis make a distinction publicly between the regime in Tehran and the Iranian people, and are actually building in Saudi Arabia a capacity to read better Iranian culture, politics, society. They've set up at least one center, maybe more, to deeply kind of engage with people who know Farsi, who speak the language, and who are trying to learn and build up internal capacity so that they don't need to rely on think tanks like the Wilson Center when looking at Iran. And that's a welcome, actually, development within the kingdom. And these people, these advisors who speak Farsi inside the kingdom in Riyadh, do make this distinction repeatedly to the leadership that the Iranian people are not the same as the regime, and in fact you have something like 2/3 of the people who would, if you had free and fair elections, probably be rid of the system of clerics. So that's one issue. Now the other issue about how the Saudis see the kingdom, and this has see Iran, and this has come out in a few statements as well, is that they look at the minorities within Iran and are looking for opportunities to perhaps use them as a way against the regime. And here I'm thinking about the Baluch, the Arabs, the Sunnis. I think this is a very kind of, this is more big talk than actual action on the part of the kingdom or any of the GCC countries. but more importantly, leaving aside Iran, where the Saudi leadership sees a problem with Iran's regime is in its policies in Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, and effectively sees Iran building or creating a noose around the kingdom, and that is something that it wishes to roll back. That kind of influence it wishes to roll back. It's limited in its capacity to roll back that influence, and I think would like to rely on the United States as much as possible to do so. Now, before I get into each individual countries and how the Saudis see them, I would like to say that in general, there are people who look at Iran and see, the sweet-talking Jawad Zarif, which is basically what people like President Obama and his advisors and many of the elites in the United States wish to notice when looking at Iran. And there are others who look at Iran and they see Qasem Soleimani and not Zarif. And the Saudis are very much in that latter tradition of looking at the Revolutionary Guards and seeing that element of the regime and its behavior. And this is where you see it very clearly manifest in the Arab world. Of course, the template for the IRGC and the greatest success story of Iran in projecting its influence through non-state actors has been Hezbollah in Lebanon. And there is a model. I think let's call it the Hezbollah model. I don't want to preempt any of your comments, but let's call it the Hezbollah model, which the Iranians would like to reproduce to a greater or lesser extent, with more or less success in any and every country they're able to do in the Arab world in which they can do so. And here you have, for instance, on a smaller scale, the Houthis in Yemen. We can get into that, but there's now clear proof and evidence of not just providing weapons, but also training ideologically and militarily in terms of discipline. And there's a clear influence of Iran through Hezbollah, sometimes directly through the IRGC in Yemen. And this is the soft underbelly of the kingdom, and it's for the kingdom, what Mexico is to the United States, or Canada is to the United States, whereas for Iran, it's not a strategic asset, but it's a cheap and easy way to needle the Saudis and threaten them. I'll get back to Yemen in a minute. In Iraq, they have been instrumental, that is, the Iran regime has been instrumental, the IRGC specifically, in building the Hashd al-Shabi, which is this popular mobilization force, which is in fact involved in the fighting against ISIS. And I'm not sure actually that, and here I'm not sure I agree with Robin, that America and Iran see ISIS in exactly the same way. I think for the United States, ISIS is a group that must be destroyed, whereas I think that ISIS can play a very useful role for the Iranians. And not least because it keeps the Sunnis divided, it keeps the Americans having to make a choice between Iran's allies and or ISIS, which is not really a real choice. If you really were interested in destroying ISIS, why would you send Shiite militias who are brutalizing Sunni populations in Mosul and throughout the Iraqi lands of Iraq, which will only produce another form of ISIS down the road? So I'm not convinced by that argument. So now let me turn to Yemen, as I promised to do so, and it's a country that I know quite well. I see this as the best avenue, actually, for a possible lessening of tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and a place where the United States can play a role. As I mentioned earlier, Yemen is a fundamental strategic country for Saudi Arabia, whereas it is not for Iran. And it would be a place to begin to de-escalate the tensions between these two countries. This could take various forms. It could be in either a show by the Iranians that they're not doing what they're doing in Yemen, or by, for instance, by withdrawing the Hezbollah trainers in Yemen, or it could be take the form of actual discussions and negotiations, perhaps indirectly through the Secretary General of the United Nations is one possibility, and he has offered that. In any case, it is a dramatic humanitarian situation, and it is a country that deserves the attention of the United States and of the world, and certainly would be, to my mind, the best avenue to pursue for a lessening of tensions. At the moment, the US administration has indicated that it will provide the Saudi military with the weaponry necessary to improve its targeting in Yemen, and all indications are that, in fact, the war in Yemen is likely to ramp up rather than go in the opposite direction. And Hodeidah, the port town of Hodeidah, is likely to be the next target for invasion, because the Houthis control it. We can get into that in the Q&A if you like. The other way in which the Saudis are reacting to Iran is basically to tell the Americans that we can reach out to Israel and we can try to help negotiate a solution to this long-standing conflict. I'm not very sanguine or optimistic about this attempt by the Saudis to work through the American president, largely because of domestic Israeli power politics. Both Prime Minister Netanyahu and his allies to his right, extreme right sometimes, are unlikely to provide any real substantive concessions to the Palestinians. And in fact, the risk here is largely for Netanyahu to engage in moves that might prove extremely embarrassing to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf allies, and therefore give ammunition, propaganda ammunition for the Iranians and the so-called axis of resistance to the West by broadcasting a message saying, see, Netanyahu really, you offer them an olive branch and all they do is punch you in the face. The only thing to do with Israel is to continue military resistance, and therefore Hezbollah in South Lebanon, missiles directed at Israeli cities, is the only avenue to pursue. In any event, going forward, I think we're looking at a period of very high tension between the Gulf states, specifically between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The Saudis are building up their military capabilities and capacities. This is a long-term project, but the aim is ultimately to be able to take on Iran without American military support, and that is something that is likely to happen, not immediately, but I think within a decade or decade and a half under the present leadership in the kingdom. Thank you.
Thank you. Haneen.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very, very interesting panel, and thank you for coming. Let's talk about Hezbollah. Today we're looking at Hezbollah in a very, very different perspective, because Hezbollah in the past 4 or 5 years has changed drastically because of the fight in Syria, because of our involvement in the Syrian crisis. But before we get there, before we start talking about how Hezbollah changed and the new phase of Hezbollah, Hezbollah has been through 3 phases so far, which has changed it as a party, but also has impacted the Shia community throughout these 3 phases. The first phase of Hezbollah is, I call it the Abbas al-Musawi phase, which is the beginning of Hezbollah in Lebanon in the 80s. It was a more ideological phase. Hezbollah was very ideological, freely talked about Islamic State in Lebanon, did not want to be involved in Lebanese political scene because they considered it dirty and corrupt. And they really focused on resistance and the ideology. Then this has changed to when they went into the second phase when Abbas al-Musawi died and Hassan Nasrallah came. Hassan Nasrallah is more of a charismatic, charming, less aggressive figure for the Shia community and for the Lebanese than Abbas al-Musawi. And this new phase was more Hezbollah dropped, or not totally dropped, but put on hold the Islamic State in Lebanon, started to be more integrated in the Lebanese state institutions, did not really mind being part of the parliament, started to have ministers, etc. But they still also focused on the resistance as the main priority in Lebanon. And this gained Hezbollah a lot more popularity in Lebanon, more popularity in the region, especially after 2000, the year 2000 liberation of the South. And Hezbollah, that was like the peak moment of Hezbollah, really. The golden age of Hezbollah is during this second phase between the year 2000, which is the liberation, and the year 2006, which is the 2006 war. Right after Hezbollah inherited the Syrian regime in Lebanon. After the Syrian regime left, Hezbollah basically inherited everything from the Syrian, including the corruption and the state institutions and everything. So that golden age really was between 2000 and 2006. Then things started to change drastically until Syria happened. And Hezbollah was decided, Iran basically decided, the Quds Force decided that Hezbollah will be involved in the Syrian war to defend the regime of Bashar al-Assad. And this is what I call the third phase of Hezbollah, which is Qasem Soleimani's phase. Nasrallah is still there, but their margin of maneuver as a Lebanese party is gone, almost gone. What they still can decide in Lebanon on little things like the electoral law, maybe a little Lebanese issues, but the major decisions of war and peace and their operations in Syria and the region is really decided by the Quds Force, mainly Qasem Soleimani. This has changed Hezbollah completely. This third phase has been very, very drastic for Hezbollah on so many levels. Positive results of this phase is that Hezbollah has gained regional presence and influence. Hezbollah today is present in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and maybe tomorrow in Bahrain, we don't know. This has given Hezbollah a very, very good influence in the region, something they've never dreamed of before, and also military capacities that came from fighting on the ground in Syria and sometimes in Iraq, but also a training role that today Hezbollah is basically training all Shiite militias in the region, the Pakistanis, the Afghanis, the Yemenis, the Iraqis, the Syrians. That Hezbollah is today like the middle, the number, it's the Quds Force number 2 in the region. But at the same time, this came with a price. The Shia community did not really respond well to this new role. They responded very well with the Hezbollah second phase with Hassan Nasrallah and the resistance and everything, but the third phase did not play well within the Shia community. Today, if you look at the Shia community in Lebanon today, they do not really have another choice because there is no alternative for Hezbollah today. But it has become a very militarized community because the only job you can get as a Shiite in Lebanon, if you cannot afford to have your own business or if you cannot afford to get a good education, is to fight in Syria. And fighting in Syria is a very lucrative job because most of the people fighting in Syria are coming from very poor neighborhoods in Dahi, the southern suburbs of Beirut, the south, and the Beqa. If you go to Dahi today, you see the lines between the neighborhoods in Dahi are very, very, very clear, clearer than ever. The poor neighborhoods are still poor. The streets are full of posters of martyrs in Syria. This is where you can tell like everybody is going to Syria from these neighborhoods. And you go to the middle class or upper middle class and rich neighborhoods in Dahi, it's a completely different story. No posters of martyrs, the war does not exist. They're very far away from it. And this is creating a very negative dynamic even within the Shiite community between the class division kind of between the poor and the rich Shiites. The social services that Hezbollah has been working, that was like one of the main pillars of Hezbollah in Lebanon, education, medical care, etc. These are all today catering only for the fighters community. So if you look at the Shia community today, you have the Shia community as a whole, Hezbollah's community, which is basically Hezbollah's members, employees, institutions, etc., and the fighters community. And the fighters community today is the only community benefiting from these social services not because the money is not coming anymore, but because the budget has changed. So today you have the same budget coming to Hezbollah, but it's more going to military operations and less to social services. Because of the sectarian rhetoric that came with the war in the region, also you have an isolated community. And the isolation of the community and the lack of social services created kind of a vicious circle for Hezbollah to also benefit from this isolation and lack of services to get more fighters into Syria. So the more isolated, the poorer these people are, the more ready they are to go and fight in Syria because they get a contract for 2 years with a salary between $400 and $1,200, depending on your experience rank. And basically, Hezbollah for the Shia community is today the sectarian protector against the Sunnis who are going to eat you alive. So basically, every Shia today is still afraid of the Sunnis. But at the same time, Hezbollah today is a corporate because it's providing jobs. And in Lebanon today, the only two people who are paying salaries on time are Hezbollah and the Lebanese state. So it is a good option. But what do we have today? We have this, Hezbollah as a corporate. Basically, we give you money, you come fight in Syria, but there's no meaning for this anymore. No one understands really what they're doing in Syria. I've been interviewing Hezbollah fighters in Syria for the past 2 years, and I've been hearing this more and more frequently that they do not believe in resistance. The supporters back in Lebanon still think that this is all about resistance, but the fighters do not. There's no meaning to everything. They'd rather do something else, but they don't have a choice. I don't hear the word resistance. I don't hear the word Israel from these fighters anymore. I only hear sectarian rhetoric. And you can tell also that the profile of these fighters have changed. I grew up in the south of Lebanon and lived through the 80s and the 90s until recently. And you can tell, like, the fighter, Hezbollah's fighter today is a very different Hezbollah fighter. Today, Hezbollah fighter is very much less ideological, but much more sectarian. They are less trained, but more aggressive. And this tells you a lot about, like, the raison d'etre of their fighting in Syria. So, at the same time, if you look at the other part of the community, for the past 11 years of relative peace along the Lebanese-Israeli border, you have a community that has developed also a business mentality. If you go to the south today, even to Dahi, you have a lot of hotels, modern style cafes and restaurants. People are investing in peace. People are investing in long-term projects in the Shia areas. And this mentality is definitely not happy with any war coming to Lebanon. So Hezbollah understands that. But also this community is far from the war in Syria. So as long as Hezbollah is involved in Syria, they don't mind as long as Hezbollah doesn't start a war with Israel. So this community also has changed in that sense. This third phase, the Soleimani phase, the more aggressive Hezbollah, the more sectarian Hezbollah, the more meaningless fight of Hezbollah, this all happened during Rouhani's first term, right? So if we're going to go back to the question of this panel of what is Rouhani's second term, is the election in Iran going to change anything in the region of Iran's foreign policy in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, etc.? My answer is no, definitely no, because we've seen this happening before, and we've seen during Rouhani's first term a more aggressive Quds force in the region, a more aggressive Soleimani, a more sectarian Hezbollah. Soleimani happened to Lebanon and the region during Rouhani's phase. In Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in the region as a whole, we do not have the Rouhanis, we only have the Soleimanis. Hezbollah managed to marginalize and eliminate all the Rouhanis within the ranks and within the Shia community. Long time ago, we only have the Soleimanis. Hezbollah and other Shia militias are under the command of the Quds force. Soleimani basically and the Quds force and the Revolutionary Guards command Hezbollah. They're part of the Quds force. So, and also, maybe my colleague will be talking more about this now, but the Quds, Rouhani and the president and the government, Iran, does not really have any say. Like, they cannot really tell the Quds force what to say. So the Quds force is separate from the government in Iran. Rouhani and the government is one thing, and the concept of the revolution is completely separate. The system makes it that way. So the Shiites in Lebanon, the good thing about all this is the Shiites in Lebanon, like the Iranians in Iran, are sick and tired of war. They don't want this confrontational rhetoric anymore. They're more interested in businesses. And they know that they do not have a Rouhani to replace Hezbollah. They know that they cannot actually have an alternative to say, like, we choose this there's none. Hezbollah makes sure that there's nothing going on. So to confront Hezbollah after this new phase is the Shiites themselves has to force Hezbollah to change. And this is going to be very, very, very hard, but it's happening on very, very small local municipal elections, for example, grassroots organizations. The Shiites are pushing a little bit for Hezbollah to change its priority. But even if Hezbollah wants to change, Qasem Soleimani will not allow it. Hezbollah's leaders tried not to go to Aleppo because they know how it will backfire in the community. They couldn't say no. They said no many times. Qasem Soleimani cut the salaries for 3 months. They went to Aleppo. So even if Hezbollah wants to change, it's not going to happen. But if we cannot contain Hezbollah from the Shiite community, and if Iran's revolutionary guards cannot be contained by Rouhani and the Iranians, the only way to do it, in my opinion, is really to confront the Iranians in the region. You cannot bomb Hezbollah. You cannot bomb you cannot like start a war and get rid of these people, because Hezbollah today is in the region, and you cannot bomb it in Lebanon, and you cannot bomb everywhere in the region. War is not really like the answer to this. But there are a lot of things that can be done. Iran's Quds Force and Hezbollah and every single Shia militias, every time they try to, every time they're confronted with the questions like, what are you doing in Syria? Why are you there? They say, Assad asked us to come, so get rid of Assad. Assad cannot stay. Assad's the main reason for these militias in Syria. So get rid of the justification. The justification does not exist, then they have nothing really, they will have to come up with something else. In Iraq, the model of Hezbollah, for example, are trying to be integrated more in state institutions. And this is something that should not be allowed, because in Lebanon, the moment Hezbollah was allowed in state institutions, they took over. And in Iraq as well, the Shia militias, the Hashd al-Shabi, the Iranian forces in Iraq should not be allowed in state institutions. There are a number of things that can be done, but we have to think, I will conclude with this one thing. It's not going to be easy, because Iran has made it clear to every single Shiite in the region that they are going to fight until the last Arab Shiites. They're not going to fight in Iran, they're going to fight in the region until the last Arab Shiites. And this is what we are facing today. Thank you.
Thank you, Haneen. Last but not least, Mohsin.
Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great honor to be back here. I'm going to talk about Iran's regional policy first, and then what I think Iran is up to in Syria and Iraq, and finally whether we should expect any kind of change now that we have a new, moderate, pragmatic president who can actually change things in Iran. It's customary in Washington, and believe me, I've been coming here for more than 2 decades. I've been to many conferences after every Iranian election, and all of us are broken record. Some of us keep saying that elections are fake, Iranian presidents are fake, that these elections have no impact on Iranian foreign policy, because ultimately it's the supreme leader who is the final decider. Well, I disagree with this, but I don't want to go through what we went through this morning. But here is an important point I want to make about the way decisions are made in Iran. And that is that in terms of foreign policy, the Iranian president seems to have more impact than he does in domestic policy. It's usually the other way around in Washington. We keep saying that the elected president has no impact in foreign policy. I submit to you, they have more room to change Iranian foreign policy than they do in domestic policy, because if they want to change domestic policies, it's going to have an impact on the balance of power. And whereas if they want to change the direction of Iranian policy, the impact is going to be a little bit less, and definitely less immediate. The second point I want to make is that oftentimes we describe Iran as an ideological regime, sort of a cause that has absolutely no flexibility and pragmatism. In fact, if you really look at Iranian policy in the past 4 years, you see that it is becoming increasingly more pragmatic than ideological. With that said, now let me get to the Iranian regional policy. Professor Haikal was talking about the perception in Saudi Arabia that Iran is surrounding them. There is some truth to that. But there is a bigger truth, which the Saudis don't want to accept, and a lot of people in Washington don't want to accept, and that is Iran too feels threatened, not by Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia's ally, the United States. Everywhere you look around Iran, you either have American military bases or you have pro-American regimes. So this business of I feel threatened, therefore I can do X and Y, I don't think it's going to explain how things are pursued in Tehran or in Riyadh. What are Iran's goals in region overall? Before I get to Iraq and Syria, I've come up with 4. One is Iran wants to create a sphere of influence because Iran feels threatened. A good colleague here was talking about how the idea of regime change is back again. Well, if you're Ayatollah Khamenei, or if you are Qasem Soleimani, or if you are an Iranian president who believes in that system, you have to protect yourself. And this has been the principal motivation of Iranian foreign policy from 1979, to create spheres of influence anywhere they can. And they started with Hezbollah. And Hezbollah has turned out to be the most effective, the most valuable strategic asset Iran has today, anywhere in the world. Anywhere in the world. The second is that, especially in recent years, especially after the invasion of Iran by Iraq with Saudi money, with Kuwaiti money, the Iranians decided that they need to develop retaliatory capability all over the Middle East so that in case they are attacked, they can do something about the attack. Third factor is that Iranian policy, regional policy, is based on linkage politics. That is, Iran does not control the capitals of 4 or 5 Arab countries, as some Iranians have said, and the Arabs keep quoting that. Iran is influential in 4 or 5 Arab capitals. And therefore, if Iran loses in one capital, loses its influence in one capital, it is very likely you're going to see a more aggressive Iran somewhere else. If Iranian influence is reduced in Syria, you can expect more Iranian influence in Iraq, perhaps in Afghanistan or Lebanon. And finally, the 4th element that determines Iranian foreign policy is the reaction to the US policy. How the US deals with Iran or seeks to deal with Iran can determine how Iran is going to operate in the region. I have no idea what the strategy of the new administration is. I think I have some ideas, but I honestly believe that they're reviewing this, and I hope at the end of this review they can come out with a good, wise, and enlightened policy. What I do see is that the US wants to keep the nuclear deal, but wants to pressure Iran to walk out. And knowing little that I know about the leadership in Iran and the clerics, they ain't gonna walk out. It ain't gonna happen. The second thing is that they wanna isolate Iran. I submit to you an isolated Iran is a more dangerous Iran in the region. Third element is that they're going to strengthen the Saudis. That's not new. They have been doing this since 1979. And finally, they're trying to push an Israeli, Saudi, perhaps some of GCC countries, united front against Iran. Again, that's not new either. Mubarak used to head this anti-Iran front, and I submit to you, none of this is going to really work, because Iran plays an important role in every major issue that America has a national interest in the Middle East, from proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, to terrorism, to defeating the despicable ISIS, and other terrorist organizations. And there is a model that we can follow, and I'll talk about this later. Now, it brings me to Syria, Iran, and Lebanon. Of the three countries or entities, I think Hezbollah and Iraq are, I would say, Hezbollah number one, a little bit lower than this. Iraq is number two, strategic interest of Iran. Finally, number three is Syria. So what is Iran up to? Number one, Iran is going to continue to empower Hezbollah one way or another. As I said, it is the only thing they have outside of Iran that they can rely on. Ideologically, they can trust those guys. And so they're going to continue doing this either through Damascus and air route, or what they're trying to do, and I think they might actually succeed, I do not know, is to create a land corridor from Iran through Iraq and eventually Syria with the help of PKK and Syrians. Now, the key is that they want to have a way to have strategic depth at the heart of the Arab world against Israel, not so much against Saudi Arabia. I believe their thinking is Israel, and they don't want to lose that, because should there be a military confrontation, the only thing Iran really has is its Hezbollah forces in Lebanon. Another goal, which is as important in my judgment as support for Hezbollah, is to never allow Iraq to become, once again, a national security threat that it was under Saddam Hussein. Keep in mind that in the past 500 years, no country, in the past 500 years, no country has inflicted as much death and destruction and damage to Iran as did Iraq in 8 years of war. And Iranians are not going to, as much as they can, to allow the emergence of an anti-Iran government in Baghdad. They will do everything they can in their power to prevent this. So far, I think they have succeeded. Whether they can succeed in the future or not, I do not know. Another key goal, and here I have to disagree with our friend, Professor Haykal, and take the side of my good friend, Robin here, about ISIL. If you really look at the ideological genesis of ISIL or Daesh, you see anti-Shiism is an inseparable component of it. And to suggest, as I have heard some people say, that Iranians are supporting ISIL, I think it's based on wishful thinking. ISIL is a force that Iran wants to defeat and has done more to defeat it than any other country I know of in that region. Name a country that has fought through its militias and through its own fighters. I think about 2,000 Iranians have been killed in Syria so far. So it's not that they hire Shiites from Pakistan and Afghanistan and they bring them to fight there. They send their own men and women there too. But Iran wants to defeat ISIL. Now, Iran cannot defeat ISIL single-handedly. And I believe there is great opportunity for the US and Iran to work together to defeat ISIL. But I'm not very sure if this is going to happen under new administration, especially because of the anti-Iran united front that some people are pushing for. But I think it is very clear that Iran and the US do want to defeat ISIL, and it is to, and it has been one of top Iranian national security priorities to defeat ISIL. And there is a red line that the Iranians have drawn. I don't remember whether it's 25 or 50 miles. They've made it very clear that if ISIL gets close to Iranian border, about 45 or 50 miles, Iran is going to intervene. Finally, the last point about Syria. I think they had a very good presentation about Hezbollah. But let me tell you a little bit about a meeting that took place many years ago between Hassan Nasrallah and Ayatollah Khomeini. Hassan Nasrallah was a young guy who was collecting religious taxes on behalf of Ayatollah Khomeini in the early days of the revolution, actually in the last days of the imperial Iran and at the beginning of revolutionary Iran. And once Iran sent about 400 or 500 revolutionary guards to Damascus during the beginning of the war with Iraq, those guys formed the genesis of Hezbollah. There is a meeting in which Hassan Nasrallah goes to Tehran and has a chance to meet with Ayatollah Khomeini. Of course, he wasn't allowed to talk much because he's a young cleric and Ayatollah Khomeini is supreme leader at that time. But after Ayatollah Khomeini gives them instruction of what they need to do, and Hassan Nasrallah goes to Ayatollah Khomeini and says, Ayatollah, I know you're very busy, but would you please allow me to report to you occasionally about the status of Hezbollah? And the answer that Ayatollah Khomeini gave him is all you need to know about why the case of Syria and Lebanon is a little bit different than the other cases. Ayatollah Khomeini turns to him and then asks Ayatollah Khamenei at that time, Hujjatul Islam Khamenei, who was a young cleric. He turns to Hassan Nasrallah and says, don't call me anymore. This is the guy who is in charge. So Ayatollah Khamenei accepted the responsibility for Syria and especially Lebanon from early days. And this has created a confusion in Washington about why presidents cannot change policy in Iran. Well, they can actually. And the nuclear deal is an example of it. It is true that the negotiations with the US began before Rouhani, but I guarantee you if Rouhani would not have been elected, if he would not have had Zarif, if we did not have President Obama and Mr. Kerry, we would not have had this deal. It's not a done deal. It wasn't a done deal. So in Syria, Ayatollah Khamenei is very concerned about Hezbollah, and he's personally in charge of the decisions that the Iranian government is making. Now, I believe that Ayatollah Khamenei and Hassan Rouhani are going to have much more flexibility about the future of Syria than a lot of people give him credit for. I remember vividly, many, many times in Washington, many Iranian experts kept saying there is no way in this world, and please Google this. This is what I love about my cell phone. I can Google it. Google and see what main experts in Washington kept saying. There is no possibility of negotiation with Khamenei, because Khamenei wants to make the bomb. He's buying time. He's not going to negotiate, because if he negotiates, the foundation, the ideological foundation of the Islamic Republic, the raison d'etre of the Islamic Republic is going to go away. It didn't. And in the case of Lebanon, in case of Syria, I believe Iran is going to be much more flexible, provided there is flexibility on the part of Washington. And let me just end by saying that it is very clear to me that there are a lot of people inside the Islamic Republic who have been very critical of Assad from the very beginning, including the late Ayatollah Hashemi Rafsanjani, who essentially condemned Assad for using chemical weapons. There are a lot of other people who are unwilling to speak out, but there is serious debate inside the establishment that there is no future for Assad in the region. But having said all of this, Iran is going to push to keep Assad, and if it doesn't work, they're going to go to option B, which is keep Assadism alive. In other words, try to do what happened in Egypt. After Morsi was overthrown, we do see that the deep state is back. This is alternative B for Iran in Syria. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohsen. And if you finish with the question I wanted to ask of everybody, which is, it seems to me that when you look at the region and Iran, clearly the crux of the matter at the moment revolves around Syria and what to do about Syria. It's true it's important for Lebanon, it's important for Saudi, it's important for the United States, and obviously for Iran. So let me start. I'll go to, since you talked about Mohsen, I'll let you finish again last. But let me start here. How do you see, if Mohsen is right, that there is a potential solution in Syria that the Iranians are willing to consider? How would you see the Saudi reaction? And how would you see Lebanon's reaction? How would you see an American reaction? Is there a way, do you think, from your country's perspectives, to look at Syria in a way in which it's different, that they will accept something else? I mean, obviously, in your case, it would be Hezbollah. Yes, we'll start with you.
Well, I mean, look, for the record, not a single Iranian died in Syria fighting ISIS. They were fighting Syrian rebels. Okay? At no point have Iranians taken on ISIS in Syria. So, just for us to be clear on that. You have to, to understand Syria, you have to see it from the perspective of the majority of the Arabs in the region. And what's happened in Syria is you essentially have an Iranian meat grinder of Sunnis. You have 500,000 dead, 11 million displaced, almost all Sunnis. This is created a situation which if I were Iranian, I would not want that stain to be on my record. All right, because it creates an enmity that will last for a very long time. I mean, memories in this region are long-lasting, and I don't see an Iranian effort. At least that's not what I read or understood from Professor Milani, that Iran is willing to compromise at all in Syria. Because what would the compromise look like? I mean, in what world would the Assad regime or a Alawi-dominated regime be allowed to stay when 70% of the population is Sunni and has been bludgeoned in this way? And what could the Saudis agree to or concede to that would accommodate Syrian sentiments, Syrian Sunni sentiments, that is? So I don't see that. That's why I was suggesting that Yemen might be a better avenue for possible negotiations. It's low hang. It's something that's not important to Iran. It's extremely important to the Saudis. And the Syrian problem, the Syrian conflict also involves, the Russians. It involves the Turks. It involves the Qataris. So there are it involves the Kurds, who, by the way, are the only ones who fought ISIS, if you really want to know, in Syria. So it's a very complicated, I think, situation to which I don't see a solution.
You don't see any solution?
Any, at all. None.
Okay. Lebanon has no say, of course. So we're talking here about Hezbollah. Hezbollah is part of Revolutionary Guards, Iran's Quds Force. So what would Iran want from Syria? Again, in my opinion, there are two things that Iran wants in Syria. One is to make sure that they still have an influence through state institutions, whether it's through Assad, obviously their best choice, or whoever comes next, but as long as they still have an impact and influence, legitimized, acknowledged by international community, presence in Syria and influence, that's number one. I don't see this is happening, but this is what they want. The second thing, which is very, very important for Iran, is what you mentioned, is the land bridge. The land bridge that was referred to by the Jordanian king as the Shah Crescent, and today the Iranians are coming back and saying it's the Iranian moon. It's today stretches from...
Full moon.
Full moon, exactly. The full
Badr.
moon. Badr. Yeah, the Shia, Badr al-Shia. It stretches from Tehran via Iraq, Diyala province, the Mosul. That's why Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi is very, very active today around Mosul and Sinjar towards the Syrian border, because from there, from the Syrian border via Iraq and Syria to Lebanon, there will be a land bridge. And what Iran wants in Syria is what they call the useful Syria, which is part of this land bridge. And they are trying to connect the borders of Iraq to the borders of Lebanon via this bridge that is today being apparently shifted because of increased US pressure. If you've heard that last week something very interesting happened when the US bombed Shia militias, Hezbollah Iranian convoy in the Tanaf region, which is in the triangle of the borders of Syria, Iraq, and Jordan, which is very, very strategic for this bridge, but also it has a lot of US presence at this point. So the reaction of this strike was the next day. Fars agency, which is associated with the Revolutionary Guards, said that they are sending 300 Hezbollah soldiers to this area. This is how the Iranians are going to react to everything. This escalation is going, in my opinion, is going to increase because the Iran will not let go of this priority. It's very important for them. They've invested too much in Syria in order to just let go of this. And I don't think that the international community is happy with this land bridge because, one, it will not only give a physical bridge for the Iranians to, move weapons from Iran to Lebanon. This is one of the importance of this bridge, but the main importance of this bridge is a platform of power that will tell the region, everyone in the region, is that we are here and we're here to stay. And Hezbollah completely understands that they're not going to Syria to come back to Lebanon. Hezbollah is no more a Lebanese party. It's definitely going to Syria and everywhere in the region to stay. And their job is to protect this corridor. And you can tell throughout this corridor, from the Qalamun region to the Damascus suburbs to Hamas to all the area where all these areas and towns and cities were evacuated, all the Sunnis were sent out to Idlib and other regions, they've been filled with many Shiites from Syria and from Iraq. So these demographic changes are also very important, and the only people who are going to protect these demographic changes and the land bridge in Syria is Hezbollah and the Shia militias, and Iran is not going to let go of that.
Thank you, Robin.
I guess I agree so far on what's been said. I think one of the contradictions that in the Trump administration, one of the many contradictions, is over what to do about Syria. President Trump has talked about dealing with the Russians, trying to looking at some kind of agreement to end the bloodshed. But the irony is, if he does, the Iranians are brought along as part of the package, and that empowers the Iranians and helps them achieve their objectives. So it's very hard to see how that plays out. Under the Obama administration, you had the creation of something called the International Syrian Support Group. One has not seen that visible any place, and of course Iran was a part of that. But as far as I know, it hasn't been convened. And the U.S. has been a marginal player as it defers to Russia, Turkey, and Iran on its peace initiative for Syria. And it's only agreed to send a kind of low-level official to Astana to participate on basically kind of on the margins. I think one thing Iran does want in Syria that it shares with the United States is it wants to see the territorial integrity of both of Syria and Iraq. I frankly find that increasingly difficult to see how you hold these countries together. Even if you decentralize power in extraordinary ways, that in itself down the road paves the way. Because of the very demographic shifts that Hanan mentioned, I think you've seen the redrawing of the map inside Syria particularly. So I don't see any potential for some kind of resolution anytime soon. And I think this is where the Russians and the Syrians, as I mentioned earlier, keep getting back to what is the alternative. And if you have elections, do you have elections a part of the country because frankly, just the question of, so if you liberate Raqqa and you end the ISIS caliphate in Syria, who takes control of that area? And there's, just like Iraq, there is no political plan on the table for either country. There may be security arrangements, but that only defers and makes and complicates, I think, the political question and makes the potential for events on the ground, for forces on the ground, to begin to create fait accompli that contradicts the idea of holding the country together, because you see the emergence of the empowering of the warlords, which is, we've seen what damage that has done in Lebanon and continues to do kind of under the table, sometimes over the table too. So I don't see any great ideas. I do think that it's one goal, as I said earlier, that I think that everybody wants to end the bloodshed, but with very different agendas, backing very different parties, and I don't see how it happens. And as a result, I think with every day that passes, the likelihood of the stabilization of Syria, even in the end of the war, even if the end of ISIS, not happening anytime soon. And with Syria as the geostrategic center of the Middle East, that is very ominous for the whole region.
Mohsen, since you touched on, I want to ask you a more specific question. If you're sitting in Tehran and you're looking at the situation in Syria, at one point it looked very hopeless for Assad, right? But it seems like Assad has consolidated position, and you may even say he's winning, relatively speaking. So why compromise on Assad?
Can I just?
Sure, absolutely.
I try to explain how the Islamic Republic is looking at the region. If they would have asked me, which they didn't, and they won't, I guarantee you, I would have told them very bluntly, and I've said it many times, that it is not in the national interest of Iran to A, become a hostile power toward Israel, for sure, and secondly, to get involved in supporting Assad in Syria. I just, no matter how you slice it, I can't see how that serves Iranian national interest. That's my personal view. But Tehran doesn't see it that way. They think if Syria goes, that entire axis of resistance is going to collapse. And they think demography is on their side. The reason why they think demography is on their side, is that, and I know this is very uncomfortable for some people to accept, it is true that Shiites are a minority, about 15 to 25% of the Islamic world. But Shiites are a majority in the Persian Gulf and Levant in terms of actual number. You combine the population of Iran with the Iraqis, Shia Iraqis, with the Shiite in Bahrain, with the Shiite in Saudi Arabia, with the Shiites in Lebanon, and with the Shiites in Syria, they are the majority. They think demography is destiny and demography is with them. Now, whether they're right or wrong, I don't know. I'm telling you how they're looking at this. The second point I want to make, not a single word has been said about the role Russia is playing in Syria, and not a single word has been said about the destructive role the regional powers have played in providing financial and training to some elements that are at least partially responsible for the killing in Syria. I'm awfully sorry. I am a peaceful man. I have been following Mahatma Gandhi all my life. That's where my thinking comes. But if you want to be fair, if you want to understand what is going on, you cannot say when Iran supports a group, it's bad. But if the Saudis provide a lot of money under the table, that's not bad. You cannot say when the Iranians kill, it's no good, but if someone else kills, it's bad. You have to be fair. The reality is that we don't have too many clean hands in Syria. And the reality is that they're going to keep fighting one another until one side can score a military victory. In a way, I agree with you. Realistically speaking, I want Iran to show flexibility. I think they are going to show flexibility, but there are others who are not going to accept this. So this might go on and on and on. But if the US is interested in talking with Iran, I think the best place to start is not going to be in Yemen, because the Saudis are inflexible about Iran. They have this obsession about Iran, that Iran is trying to overthrow the monarchy.
Well, they've
and
said it. I mean, the Iranians are not, don't hide their animosity towards the monarchy. If you read the last will and testament of Ayatollah Khomeini, or if you read the statements in Persian of Ayatollah Khamenei, there's no secret of the desire to destroy the Al Saud dynasty. It's absolutely official Iranian policy.
Well, I'm not very sure if it's the official Iranian policy. They have said these things, but so have the Saudis.
The Saudis have said they want to destroy the regime in Tehran. I don't think so.
Well,
Not officially,
if you
not that
allow
I've
me.
heard.
Well, when you say official and non-official, that's where it gets. We know that the former foreign minister of Saudi Arabia went to Paris and attended a meeting by the Mujahideen Khal,
Yes.
in which he said, we support the overthrow of the Islamic Republic.
He's the former intelligence
Well, yes.
head of
That's
intelligence.
why I
That's
said,
correct.
if you're going to, even if you assume that Iranians are doing this, that's fine. It doesn't undermine the argument I make. Actually, it strengthens the argument. Because if both feel that way, and they are both correct, then forget about Yemen. Because Yemen is too important for the Saudis, and it's not that important for the Iranians. The place that the Americans and the Iranians can begin is in Afghanistan. That's where, once the element of trust is rebuilt between Iran and the United States, then they can go to Yemen. And the last place they want to go is Hezbollah. But I have to tell you, one thing I 100% agree with you, 100%, unconditionally. The massacre in Syria, the death of 500,000 people, is something that has tarnished the credibility of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and that's why they need to review their policy toward this killing. There is simply no justification. This is why I said, I don't understand why they're doing this. That is why I said at the very beginning, even before you made your claim, I said there are elements in the Islamic Republic that see that, but unfortunately, they don't have the audacity, they don't have the commitment. And frankly, they want to protect their job the way a lot of people are protecting their jobs here. So they're not saying anything. But this has to come to an end. But unfortunately, as I said, there are too many elements. There is a regional element, there is an international element, and there is the domestic element of the Syrian civil war. And the three must be aligned in order to find a solution. That's why it's so important for the US to cooperate with Russia. It's so important for Iran and Saudi Arabia to sit down and talk. Ultimately, I believe it is in the national interest of Iran and Saudi Arabia to put an end to this nonsense, to talk. They can't get rid of each other in that region. There are two Islamic countries. They must find a way to talk to one another and stop interfering in each other's affair. That can be done as long as we are fair and we don't take one side and do not look at the activities of the other side.
All right, let me take some questions from the audience. Please identify yourself and.
Hi, Deniz Yüksel from Turkish Industry and Business Association. And my question is with regards to Syria. Do you think there is a potential for some sort of positive Russian influence on Tehran that will kind of push them to reduce the influence and the activity of Shiite militias, maybe reducing sectarianism and paving the way for a political solution, perhaps coupled with some sort of Russian support for a Syrian army that is rebuilt without being under the sway of Iran? Thank you.
I guess, Mohsen, that question is for you.
When it comes to Russia and Iran, I remember when the Syrian war, civil war started, the thinking was that if we support the rebels, that means we're going to decouple Iran from Syria. It didn't happen. It made only Iran and Syria closer. Now the thinking is that we can make a deal with Putin. And if we make a deal with Putin, he is going to pressure Iran to change its policy. Well, good luck about making a deal with Putin about Syria. Because I think it's going to be very difficult for two reasons. A, Iran, I think, is the most important ally Russia has in the Middle East. And it is through Iran that it can expand its influence throughout the Arab world. I know they're not taking side in the Shia-Sunni rivalry, and they are very smart, nor should the United States. This is not something that is going to ultimately serve American national interest. But the Russians are looking at Iran as a sort of a stepping stone to expand their influence and to revive the Soviet empire again. And when it comes to Syria, there is more coordination between Iran and Iran and Russia than meets the eyes. It goes back to, I think, if I'm not mistaken, to 2010, when the Iranian National Security Council and the Russian National Security Council signed an agreement to exchange intelligence, specifically about one of the points was about Syria. So they see eye to eye in Syria, and it's going to be very difficult to separate them. But I think Russia can have, Russia can influence the decision Iran is making. And it seems to me that another country that can impact Iranian policy in Syria, more than Saudi Arabia, more than other Gulf countries, is Turkey. They can do it, and I think they're getting a little bit closer to one another, despite all the disagreements they've had.
Kim.
Good afternoon. Kim Ghattas with the BBC and the Wilson Centre. A question for you, Mohsen Milani, please. You said at the beginning that President Rouhani has more power than we give him credit for when it comes to affecting foreign policy. So considering what happened over the last 6 years in Syria and Iran's policy there, obviously, you know, he wasn't president at the very beginning, but he was president for the last few years. What should we deduce then from his views on foreign policy? If he has that power that you say, does that mean that he sees eye to eye with the Supreme Leader and the IRGC on Iran's role in Syria? Or does that tell us that he sees it differently but hasn't wanted to make a difference? Should we deduce that if suddenly tomorrow there was no Supreme Leader anymore in Iran, that Rouhani's policy towards Syria would remain unchanged? Or do you expect a change to come now that he's more secure because he's won a second term?
But if I'm not mistaken, the assumption of your question is that he is looking at Syria radically different than Ayatollah Khamenei. I don't think he does. And if you look at what he has been saying, it's very clear that he believes that we have to have elections. Now, how are you going to conduct elections in Syria? I have no idea. But the question you ask, I think, is the key question. And I think this morning, Ali Baez summarized it well. And that is something that people don't pay enough attention to, because they have a model. And the model is that the Supreme Leader decides in vacuum. It doesn't operate that way. This is not the way the Islamic Republic operates. That is not the way decisions are made in Iran. The Revolutionary Guards, Qasem Soleimani, doesn't make policy. He implements policy. But it is a convenient way of describing Iran in a way that some people would like to depict Iran. Consensus is the key. There are a number of players, key players in Iran. When important decisions about Syria has to be made, when important decisions about Iraq has to be made, these centers of power are key. And they are all assembled in the Supreme National Security Council. There they decide. One is the Supreme Leader, who usually does not get involved in initial discussions. They take one or two options to him, he chooses from those options. But we have the Revolutionary Guards as one powerful element in formulating policy. We have the President of the Islamic Republic, who is another powerful element in making policy. Then we have the informal structure of decision making, specifically foundations and the clerics, because they have their own network of supporters in Iraq, in Syria, in all important places where Iran has created spheres of influence. They bring all those together to the National Security Council, and then based on the factors I talked about, the perception of threat, etc., they come out with a policy. Now, we haven't seen much change in Iranian policy towards Syria, but we do see some changes in that Iran, thanks to President Obama, was invited to go to the Geneva Convention as part of dealing with the civil war. I think that is positive. And there are other things that Iran could have done that I believe did not do because of pressure from people like Rouhani, Hashemi Rafsanjani, and others who didn't want to push too much supporting Assad. So overall, I would say, when it comes to Syria, President Rouhani's influence has not been as profound as, say, in his policy toward the West and the United States. He has limited capital, and he decided in the first 4 years to use that limited capital to strike a nuclear deal with Iran and stay away from other important issues, because if he would have called for, say, complete change of policy towards Syria and negotiation with the West, believe me, he would not have survived.
Questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Isabella Zox with the University of Southern California. I was wondering if you think that growing distrust or doubt surrounding U.S. leadership will give the European view of having a more open relationship with Iran more foothold, particularly with U.S. allies.
I don't think it has anything to do with European perceptions of Donald Trump or the administration, the drama that's playing out here. I think the Europeans have already made their decision, and they're sticking with the course of action that's been charted. They intend to kind of do their own thing. I do think they will be limited to some degree by their corporations or industries particularly about doing more than selling goods. The idea that you want to invest long term, I think, is more doubtful, because a lot of companies are afraid that they'll get trapped and the U.S. will impose some sanctions in 2 years or 5 years, and that their investment will basically be lost. So I think they'll modify what they do, in part because of the Trump administration, but that it's not because of the distrust of the administration itself.
Can I just say something quickly on this?
Sure.
Look, I think the way to think about the Europeans is that they're bottom feeders. You know, essentially they're cut out of the big deals in Saudi Arabia and the UAE and so on, and they're looking for economic opportunities, and those are in Iran. The only weapon that the U.S. has, and as Robin rightly pointed out, is the U.S. Treasury, basically to penalize them for any business they might possibly do in the United States should they engage in deals with the Iranians. And that's a real threat, because they're never going to privilege Iran over the American market.
Ali.
Hi, thank you. Two questions for Bernard. One is, can you outline briefly what is threat perception inside of Riyadh in practice of direct Iranian threats to the Saudi kingdom in terms of practical direct, I mean, besides from what's happening in Yemen, which is a recent development in terms of direct Houthi action against the borders of the kingdom, but direct threat perceptions of Iran. And secondly, if you were sitting in Tehran and you were reading the interview of Mohammed bin Salman recently, which says very clearly the plan is to make the battle for Iran inside Iran, how would you interpret that? And what are the signals that are coming out of Riyadh in terms of how far it is willing to go to confront Iran directly within its borders? And a question for Robin is, are there moderating forces within the United States at the moment directly providing input into the strategic review on Iran in terms of to the extent to which there is going to be a U-turn or a shift on Iran policy, how that will look like? Because there are also those within the DoD that remember how messy Iraq got in the mid-2000s, and do they really want to risk going back to that sort of a relationship with Iran, where there has been a phase now in the recent years of deconfliction in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, where it looks like troop numbers of the United States are going to increase?
Yeah, so I think that, I mean, I've met with Mohammed bin Salman several times, and you know, the view is that Iran has perfected the use of non-state actors as an instrument of projecting influence. And I mean, you know, that's not unique to Saudi Arabia. Everyone kind of sees this. You have to remember that as President Trump's plane was landing in Riyadh, a ballistic missile was launched from Yemen that hit, as you know, a region south of Riyadh, and was intercepted. So the perception is that, you know, you use non-state actors, and I think the threat about domestic, you know, that the challenge will come domestically in Iran will be, you know, if you plan to support non-state actors, Shiites in Saudi Arabia, we can play that dirty game as well. Although I think that his hope is that the economic pressures in Iran, because of sanctions and the U.S. Siding with the Saudis and so on, will eventually create a bigger room for maneuver for the 2/3 of the Iranian population who don't like the regime. And so he's not against the Iranian people, he's against the regime in part, and specifically the tactics of the regime in using non-state actors, arming these non-state actors, using ballistic missiles that can reach Saudi Arabia, just like there are ballistic missiles that can target Israeli cities. That sort of way of operating is unacceptable. And the Iranians, I have to hand it to them. I mean, you know, given all that what Professor Milani described as their grand strategy, they've managed to alienate all the Sunnis, bring the Saudis and the Israelis together. You know, that's quite an achievement. And if that can be built on in a concrete way, I think it's a formidable challenge to the regime in Tehran.
Robin.
Moderating forces in the United States. Where? When you look at the NSC, it has been staffed largely with defense intelligence people. The people that Michael Flynn appointed are largely still there. Rex Tillerson has very limited, made almost, except for the number 2, very few appointments at the State Department. You could argue that the career people at the State Department know Iran, understand the complexities of our engagement or disengagement or confrontation in the past, and yet they're not empowered, they're not part of the inner circle. So I don't think there's anyone there. It's very unlikely we're likely to see any modification of the toughest possible line against Iran. This is something that Donald Trump believes to his core, and the inner circle around him believes to its core. And I just don't see a single person that is likely to have much influence in swaying them. If the Iranians, you know, if it should get to a point that the Russian, Turkish, Iranian peace deal moves forward and there's something viable or that seems, you know, appealing to even explore on the table, maybe they'd engage. But I, you know, always with that caveat that Iran can't gain out of this.
Last question, yeah.
Hi, my name is Srividya Dasaraju. I'm from the University of Southern California. So my question is about Turkey and Iran's relations. There's evidence that seems to indicate Turkey wants a greater regional role in the Middle East and that it's opposed to Iran's choices in Syria and Iraq. So my question is, do you see tensions rising between the two countries, or do you think economic ties will keep them as allies in the future?
You need to answer that one, Henri.
Yeah.
Tensions between Turkey and Iran? Is that what you finished with? I mean, there's no question that the Turks do want to increase their influence in the region. I mean, I think this is the next step for Erdogan now that he's consolidated power in Turkey and he has all the executive presidency, and he always goes one step further, and I think the Middle East is for him the next area. The interesting thing, of course, is going to be the Turkish-American relationship. If the Turkish-American relationship goes south, then there will be greater incentive to collaborate and cooperate with the Iranians. But even there, I mean, there is to some extent, there's a limit because of Syria. I mean, on Syria, I don't see the Turks and the Iranians agreeing in terms of the future of Syria at the moment. Right? If something were to happen in Syria independent of both countries, right, a solution emerges independent, then yes, then you can see more collaboration and cooperation. I actually do think that Turkish-American relations are not going to recover anytime soon. I think, and because also Turkish-European relations are also being affected by what's happening within Turkey. And as a result, there will be a tendency on the part of Erdogan now to go and look at the Middle East as, but I don't think he has formulated a strategy yet. I don't think he has focused on it yet because he was so focused on consolidating power at home. And I think slowly you will see the emergence of some kind of strategy. I mean, there are hints in his speeches about what role he thinks Turkey should play, but I think it's not well defined yet.
May I just make
Sure, please.
One of the things that I keep hearing is this notion that the Sunni world is supportive of this united front against Iran. I'm afraid that's inaccurate because it is accurate to say some Arab Sunni countries are against the Islamic Republic. But to generalize that as if Saudi Arabia represents the entire Sunni world is not to pay enough attention to the subtleties, to the differences between different Sunni sects and different countries. Pakistan has 80% Sunni population. I don't see them as a hostile force toward the Islamic Republic. Indonesia, I don't see it as a hostile force. Even Egypt. As a matter of fact, Egypt's position regarding Syria is closer to Iran than it is to Saudi Arabia. Yes, some Gulf countries, not all of them, are against Iran, and some of those countries are justified because Iran has intervened. There is a history of Iranian involvement, including support for assassinations, for coups d'etats. I give them every right to be upset. Saudi Arabia has the right to be upset about certain things. But let's not make this a much bigger thing than it is, because it is not. It is limited to some countries in the region, and it is no more than that.
On that note, thank you all for coming, and thank you to the participants and to the Open Society program that supported this. And now we can
You're
eat.
worse than me about it.
Well, I've got a story that's about to come out.
When? I'm sorry. What?